Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Environment Select Committee. I am Councillor Will Pascal, Chair of the Environment Select Committee, and this meeting has been held in accordance with the government regulations on holding virtual meetings. Please bear with us if we run into some technical challenges during the meeting. This meeting is being held via Microsoft Teams live conferencing, and all the committee members, council officers and parties who wish to participate in this hearing are joining from remote locations. The event is also being streamed live, and members of the public and the media are welcome to follow the meeting remotely and listen to discussions taking place. I would first like to welcome any viewers who've not been with us before to the Environment Select Committee. And the first thing that I'd really like to say in this meeting is that I think it would be appropriate for us to start with 72 seconds silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, you're on mute.
Sorry, I apologise. Thank you, everybody. Next, I would like to record our empathy with all those who have suffered personally and loss during COVID, and also to thank all those in the community who have helped in every way that they have. Now, before we proceed with the meeting, I would like to ask members of the committee to mute their microphones and only to unmute themselves when they're addressing the meeting. Once they're done, they should mute themselves again. Likewise, to save bandwidth, I would ask councillors only to switch on their cameras when speaking and to remember switch them off after they've spoken. If a councillor wishes to speak in a particular item and has not been called to speak, please indicate by typing the use of raise your hand function in the chat. And to assist your fellow councillors, officers and members of the public watching online to identify you, please state your name before you speak. If for any reason your connection drops out and you miss something, please let me know. If my connection drops, I nominate Vice Chair Charles O'Connor to take over the meeting. And to further note, during the current pre-election period, the council has to be careful that it does not do anything that might cause a reasonable person to conclude that it is spending public money to influence the outcome of the election. Councillors and officers, we all need to be alert to this. In colloquial terms, it's called PERDA. So in our meeting this evening, whilst business as usual, we must continue. Reports and discussions about matters that could have a bearing on the election must be avoided. And I would like to ask of anyone participating in the meeting that if you do not speak in a way or on issues that could be seen to be seeking influence on voters. Whilst very important, most of what we have to discuss tonight is reasonably technical. So I hope that there aren't any areas where we will stray. I would like to declare my interest as Chair of Governors of Marlborough Primary School, which is featured in the reports under item A8, and also that I have a business interest in Lotts Road. I will now ask members one by one to confirm whether they are present and whether they have any interests to declare. Now I'll call out by name, and if you could answer both that you're here and that you don't, or that you do have interest to declare. Councillor Arian Naretti.
Present Chair, nothing to declare. Thank you.
Councillor Marwan El Nagi.
President Chair, nothing to declare. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwan. I'm sorry your connection is very thin at the moment. I don't know whether it's you can reposition your aerial or something of that sort. But anyway, good to hear from you. Councillor Charles O'Connor.
Present and nothing to declare.
I have a notification that Alison Jackson is running late, but if she could let me know, or Hannah, if you could indicate.
Mr. President, nothing to declare. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwan. We heard you. Thank you. Councillor Laura Round, you here?
Present and nothing to declare.
Thank you. Welcome, Laura. Councillor Portia Thaxter.
Present, Chair, nothing to declare.
Thank you, Portia, very much. So I've had an apology for Councillor Rendell for not coming tonight, and I understand that Councillor Will is not coming as well. Is that right, Hannah?
Yes.
No, there's no other apologies as far as I know.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Apart from Alison Jackson saying that because she has a clash of meetings, which she'll join us as soon as she can. Okay, item A2, minutes of the previous select committee meeting. The minutes of the 3rd of February meeting have been circulated. Does the committee agree to sign them off as a correct record? Now, I will take silence as an agreement, but I do note that Portia Thaxter raised the issue in our pre-meet that strangely she was on the list of councillors attending the meeting, and then in the minutes she's recorded as not being there. So hopefully we got that corrected, Hannah. And our apologies about that, Portia. We know you're here tonight. So
Thank you.
and thank you for pointing that out. Has anybody else got any corrections to the minutes to point out, or are we agreed? Okay, I'm taking that as the minutes are okay, so we'll take the minutes as read and agreed. Declarations of interest we've already covered. A4 is our first item, which is the integrated neighbourhood community safety model. And the paper's been, as all papers have been, they've all been circulated, and everybody's had a chance to read them. There will be questions from any member who wishes to ask, but Portia has very kindly agreed to come forward with the first question. So Portia, perhaps you'd like to kick off.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll just like to say this is a very interesting integrated model for our community. But I'll just like to know, how do they have any form of data on how this is working in practice? How are you monitoring the effectiveness of this model?
Who is leading from Emma Will is not here tonight. Who's leading for officers on this?
That would be myself, Chairman. Stuart Priestley. I'm the Chief Community Safety Officer for the Council.
Thank you, Stuart, very much. And thank you very much for your paper. Portia's posed the first question, so perhaps you'd like to pick up on that.
Yeah, I haven't got that detail at my fingertips, but if I might just by way of explanation, just describe the kind of processes, and then I'm happy to kind of go away and get some of the kind of more granular detail if that's what councillors want.
That would be good. Yeah.
So very much the approach is about trying to put in place a partnership, intelligence-led approach to tackling antisocial behaviour and crime, both across the authority and particularly with all of the enforcement teams that we have available to us, plus those engagement teams, and with the police. So it's a weekly, it's the nub of it focuses around a weekly intelligence sharing and tasking meeting, which is chaired by a senior member of the community safety team with a breadth of attendance, including the police. And we work very closely with partners to look at those issues that are of most concern that have been reported to the police or through the council from residents and sometimes through councillors, looking at the resources that we are already applying to an area, if we are or if we're not, thinking about how we might join up our services where that makes sense, perhaps working jointly with the wardens and the police, or the wardens and noise nuisance in some regard, and then we will deploy those resources to tackle those issues, and then we assess the effectiveness at the following week's meeting. So this is really an apparatus to join up what we're doing already and trying to add value to the range of different services that we've got. So really, that's the kind of apparatus. The neighbourhood bit is that the focus is very much around those type of crimes and antisocial behaviour issues that are of concern to residents and get reported through to us, but often by volume. I'm thinking waste, noise, youth-related ASB associated with street population, street drinking, begging, rowdy, inconsiderate behaviour, those type of issues. That's the sort of bread and butter of the tasking. What's the approach doesn't necessarily lend itself to, and we have a separate set of processes, and that's responding to violence. So whether that be serious youth violence or domestic abuse, we have a kind of a separate set of processes, but these processes do talk to one another. So the effectiveness, if you like, Councillor, is monitored week to week on our ability to either make a problem go away, or that we are significantly reducing its impact. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's quite helpful. Thank you. I just wanted to see some sort of data, but thank you for the explanation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Portia, for kicking off that. Could I go to other members of the committee? Does anybody else wish to ask a question on this subject? Perhaps I could prompt one in the meantime then. Stuart, I think this marks considerable progress in the bringing together of what might have been called the CREST on one hand and the community safety team on the other hand. I know you, in effect, work as a overall team under three of the directors, working under Sue Harris as executive director. So this bringing together of the services provision into a sort of integrated arrangement is undoubtedly great progress. And I know you've got some IT background teething issues to sort out and a whole number of nitty-gritty bits. But the question I wanted to ask was to do with the sort of front end, the customer service front end. What progress are you able to report, or difficulties that you still have to overcome with regard to having a front end that is, if you like, not the provision of services, but a service that residents can present a problem, see its progress and see its resolution, and so on. So, you know, sort of track and trace resolution issue. I know it's perhaps not as simplistic as that, but that's really the question.
So it's a really good question, Chairman. I think that this is sort of straying more to the CREST project, which, for those who are not familiar with, that's the Customer and Resident Focused Environmental Services Transformation Programme. That's quite a mouthful. That seeks to join up where it makes sense or align the various teams and services across the Environment and Communities Directorate that are front-facing and working with communities to provide both efficiencies, but very much that single front door, but not just the single front door, the ability for residents to effectively track the issue that they've brought to the council. And my colleague Tim Davis is the head of CREST, and he is leading this area. There's the solution to this is an IT solution, as you inferred, Will. That we need to be able to work out a system and a process whereby Our residents can come to us via different platforms and different means. They can raise a concern with us, and that we can then take that concern and see that concern through a system and keep them in the loop as we progress that to a satisfactory solution. We are not quite there as an organisation around that as a model, but certainly that's an aspiration for us, that we're much more joined up with that front end. So I think some of the things that I've described to you today, residents won't see the front end of that, but what they will see, I hope, is the benefits of us being more effective and joined up, so that we're not having to go back to issues and problems again and again and again, or where we've got a situation where we've got one team going out and then another team going out the following week. By having a central hub for tasking and bringing all of those issues to one locus, I think we're better able to join up our services. But that front end piece, as you say, that's a work in progress for us at this point.
Okay, so perhaps if my colleagues are agreed, it would be useful for us to, as a sort of recommendation, to encourage, to welcome, first of all, the progress on joining up the services provision, and encourage that to be completed, because I understand there's still a certain amount of, I don't know how to put it, matrix management across different business streams. I know that you've done a lot of work, you and Tim, on this and others, but to encourage that to be completed, and also to recommend that the customer front end or customer facing front end with its appropriate IT backup is addressed as a priority, because I think we all want that to happen. And I think that from a select committee point of view, we can't make policy or whatever, but we can urge focus and urgency on that, because at the moment, I think there's a lot of inefficiency in what it has the bits of a very good system, and it's very frustrating to use from the resident point of view. There's beginning to be the point where there's a very good entity which the residents can't see, which is a great shame. But is that a fair recommendation, do you think, Stuart?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll take that back and speak to my colleagues.
Okay, so Hannah, have you made a record of that recommendation?
Yes, Chair.
And is everybody on the committee agreed with that? Are we happy to, since it doesn't appear we have any other questions, unless anyone want to raise it, should we take A4 paper as read and scrutinised? So thank you very much indeed, Stuart, and thank you for doing your paper at short notice. I know you have very, very busy life and did actually have to take some leave. I think, we don't normally allow leave for officers, but we insisted on it this occasion.
You're more than welcome.
So well done. So thank you very much indeed. Right, if we could move on to paper A5. Now, Charles, if you're with us, subject to your IT connection, perhaps you could lead us on this one.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I just wanted to say at the outset, I've enjoyed reading this SPD, and I thought it was another excellent document from the team. And I thought it was accessible, visually engaging, and very clear. It's good on trees, one of my favourite subjects, transport and infrastructure, and emphasises the need for extremely high quality design on this exciting site. It really brings the site alive for me, and is a rather exciting document, really. I commend officers for their production of this very good paper. My question is around housing and tall buildings. I'm highly conscious of the need for us as a borough to meet our housing targets, and that if we don't do that, decisions will be taken out of our hands, and potentially poor quality homes or poorer quality homes forced upon us by the mayor. And so this does mean tall buildings in certain places to meet those targets. I'm personally, resigned to that. That said, COVID has changed everything, and everything that we thought we knew turns out to be not quite as we thought. There have been some really interesting articles about this recently in the context of housing and infrastructure, for example, about HS2 and the existential threat to town centres. So what I'd like to know is whether we have built in sufficient flexibility within this SPD to react to changed housing needs in the future. It may be, for example, that we don't need to build such tall buildings as we thought we did, because we know tall buildings are unpopular with many residents, and so it may be unnecessary to build as high or as many tall buildings as we thought would be necessary pre-COVID. So my question is whether this document is sufficiently flexible to react to changing housing needs. I think the answer is probably yes, and I think that the document is good on tall buildings generally, and there are ranges of housing needs discussed. But please, can I hear what officers and the lead member have to say on this? Thank you.
Shall I have a first go at that, Chair?
Yes, that would be very good, Johnny. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you. And whilst I've been talking, we've had the happy reports that Chelsea appear to be ready to pull out of the European Super League. So this is truly a great night. I thought Charlie made a very thoughtful contribution, actually. I think he's right. This is a really good document. It's a very exciting site, and I think part of that involves some challenges, and the biggest one is around tall buildings. It's something that I've really wrestled with, and I know officers have too. The context, which Charlie will be aware of, but I'm sure, is that the site allocation is 3,500 homes and 2,000 jobs minimum. We've done more detailed viability work since we've started producing this document, and that suggests that actually we'll need even more homes to make the site viable if we're to deliver the other sort of improvements that are contained within the SPD. And in order to do that, you do need a level of density that is, pretty different for Kensington and Chelsea. So the challenge for us is how we can accomplish that. And I always get back, I don't think this is a political target, in as much as that Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, set the site allocation, and that was retained by Sadiq Khan. So that we've had two mayors of different political shades set that, and therefore it seems to me an overwhelming push to deliver housing on a site like this. And I think it is genuinely one of the 2 or 3 sites that are of London-wide scale, particularly along with Earl's Court. I think just dealing directly with whether it builds in the flexibility, I'm really keen that it does. I think what you said about changing lifestyles and work patterns are relevant. And I will be, and by way of this too, am challenging officers to build in as much flexibility as they can. But I think the key point is the one that you raised around the ranges that are expressed. I'd like to think that by including what is a fairly big range, we can then guide towards what seems to suit our needs best as time passes. So hopefully that starts to tackle it. But if officers have any ideas about how we could build in even more flexibility, then I would certainly support that.
Would anybody from the officers like to add to that before we go to supplementary or second questioning?
Not really. I think just to back up what Councillor Thalasitis has said, I think there's a balance to be struck here. And it is one about optimising site delivery, which is incredibly important. And inevitably that will involve taller buildings, but there will need to be a balance at some point struck about what actually that materialises in terms of viability, what can be delivered, and how that might translate into the townscape. So I think we're aware of that, but it has been built into the document so that so that you can basically consult, provide your comments on that particular aspect of it.
Fine. Charles, do you want to come back with any further points out of the questions or raise any other issues?
No, I think those answers go some way to reassuring me. Yeah, as I said, I think it's a very good document.
Right. Now, I know that there's another hand up, but I can't see who it is. But
Me, Chair.
is that Portia? Is that
Yes,
right?
it is.
Yes, good. Portia, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I would like to mention something. I think it's a very good report. However, throughout this whole report, clearly we need more homes. The local residents and other people would like to come into our borough to live. However, where the primary school, where's the GP surgery, where's the travel station, where's our green spaces considering we've declared a climate emergency? No open space in the plan. So can someone just brief me on that, or that's in the making?
So, Jonathan, would you like to answer? Or Johnny,
Yeah.
I don't know which way you guys want to do it between you. I'll leave it up to you two to decide.
Well, I guess I can fill in on the political side, and then John can add to that. We certainly do want to deliver open space and transport improvements and all the rest of it. All of these kind of things are covered in discrete sections in the SPD. I think education and health are too, if I recall correctly. I know that where we haven't proposed things, for example, a new school, that will have been underpinned by detailed work in terms of looking at future populations and densities, and if on the basis that there might be falling roles in other parts of North Kensington and across the borough, the need is less than would suit a new primary school, or for example, that's a decision that hopefully we can be quite open about. But we are thinking about all of those things, and clearly we want to create mixed communities and make sure that as much as possible there's the infrastructure to support all of these new homes. I think actually of all of the things that you raised, one that's really challenging is the transport piece. It's a fairly complex site with quite a lot of constraints. There's only really one existing access road. And given that we now appear to know that there's unlikely to be a cross-rail station with it, for better or for worse, that presents a new challenge too. I think whilst I cover that, I would only say that we also have some segregated cycling in the SPD, which I'm sure will be welcomed by many people across London. John, do you want to add to that?
Not really. I mean, it's incredibly important that we do provide the infrastructure to go with the homes that we wish to provide, and we totally recognise this. So all of those aspects that you've mentioned, we will have addressed in some detail. We have spoken to our education colleagues about school needs. As Councillor Thaddasaitis has mentioned, it doesn't necessarily translate into a discrete school, but there will be contributions from the developers to look at expanding or providing better facilities for surrounding schools. And so all infrastructure is addressed. And as I said, we've had quite detailed discussions on those various aspects. So it certainly will be addressed. We will see what comes out of the comments that we receive, and I'm sure we will revisit it. But it is something that we have looked at, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Anybody else from the committee like? Thank you, both Jonathan and Johnny. Anybody else in the committee like to raise a question at this stage? I would. If not, I would like to ask a question myself, is that I have considerable reservation about tower blocks or really tall buildings, in the sense that the history since, well, going back even as far as the Second World War, has proven that they can work, but in many cases they don't. And there are a whole range of factors, from design to how they're managed to a whole number of things involved in that. But the country is littered with sites that have had to be knocked down because they don't work. Some obviously they weren't built very well, but many of the others just found it not possible to provide a sustainable community. So what I was, and this I think is where what Charles O'Connor was saying with regard to the post-COVID realization, the need for flexibility in home provision to allow for working from home. We may not work from home as much as we have done during COVID, but we may work from home part of the time, and therefore there are a range of factors, some of which from past experience that I alluded to, and some of which from more recent experience, put a question mark on the tower block communities. Whereas we have a great body of experience in the borough with regards to mansion blocks achieving quite considerable densities, providing both in the resident, the RA sector, the public housing sector, and in the private sector, some very good communities. Some at a very modest financial point, and some at some very exclusive ones. So, what I would like to know is whether the officers feel that they have a body of evidence that convinces us thoroughly that we can, in this instance, provide sustainable communities. And I'm not here talking about energy, although that's an important issue. I'm talking and climate change. I'm talking about here about social aspect of sustainable communities and the management of these buildings to go with that, and matching of the need in terms of family types, ranging from single people through to large families, and that how this will be put together to make a successful, because this is probably our last big site in Kensington Chelsea, and we really must make a big success of it. I'm sure we all hope that we will do that. But what I would like to ask for is it possible, Jonathan, for you and other officers within a week or so, just to summarise from the evidence that you have and in the SPD, what convinces you that it is possible to provide sustainable communities in this context going forwards? The reason I'm asking for this is that I think that it's a point that's been made by several of the members of the committee, and certainly I've discussed it with some of them outside this and with other colleagues. I would like to propose to the committee that we actually make a measured response to the SPD consultation, and I know that hasn't got an unlimited time to run. I think it's towards the end of May, isn't it, Jonathan? If that's correct. So what I'm asking for is, rather than just taking away a few notes in the minutes, that we actually have a short resume, and I'm not talking about another paper. I'm just talking about a summary of the items that can make you convinced in your recommendation of this SPD to address the issue of sustainable communities, because I think this is extraordinarily important going forward. So that, and I think the next point I wanted to make is I understand that we have a tall buildings SPD, but that it's being refreshed and it's a work in progress. But I think another recommendation that we would make is that that work on tall buildings SPDs is aligned with the thinking that goes through on the Kensal SPD, because it would not be correct for us to have, if you like, two policy directions, one for Kensal and one for the borough. I think that each should inform the other. And I know that the tall buildings SPD is not in consultation at the moment, but it's a recommendation that should be in alignment. And the third point I'd like to make is purely a technical one, is that please, this excellent paper was very nearly illegible, either in printed or screen form, because of the way it was presented of two landscape pages alongside each other, meaning that the scale was extremely small. Now, if they were just done sequentially, as would be normal, it would be, there were one or two cases where they had to be alongside, but in general terms, if we could just make sure that the legibility item is covered. I know it's not really strictly to do with today's meeting, but I think it's a lesson for publication of papers, be it electronic or paper. So I think the main thing I'm asking for, I think perhaps both to you, Johnny, and to Jonathan, we would like to ask for a paper that if you like, summarizes the reasons why officers are recommending to you for your decision that this SPD is sufficiently evidenced that it will produce sustainable community in using the tall forms of buildings that we've talked about.
Thanks, Will. I think that's a really useful intervention, actually. I think I touched on this when I spoke a few minutes ago. I have to say, I'm not necessarily wholly comfortable with some of the density that we're talking about. Taken in the abstract, it's probably not what I would propose, and to a degree we have to be led by the site allocation, otherwise we do face mayoral call-in and the powers that be imposing housing delivery on us. This SPD is us trying to balance some of the trade-offs, and I'm ready, I readily acknowledge that there are some concerns about tall buildings with some good reason across the borough, and particularly in North Kensington. I think the kind of paper that you're describing would be helpful just to have it set out, and I'm happy to encourage officers to produce that fairly quickly. I want to make sure that whatever we land up adopting out of this reflects a full and frank conversation about the compromises that are involved in delivering a site of this scale.
And I think one detail that would be very useful to include in that, I forgot to mention it, is that I may have read this wrong, but in my reading of the paper, I understand that there is not an intention to put anything on top of the re-provided supermarket. And I find that very strange because, urban development of this sort of density across the world very often includes a sort of layer cake arrangement with residential on top of offices, on top of supermarkets or whatever. And it would be a site area lost to the site if it wasn't provided on top of. And I mean, there's no difficulty in construction terms at all to do that. I mean, there's at least 2 or 3 being built in the borough at the moment. If you think about what's happening on King's Road, what's happening on Kensington High Street, and I'm sure I've forgotten one as well, but there are certainly several across London being constructed at the moment. If I read it wrong in the SPD, I apologise. But if that, because the supermarket's a big floor plate, and it seems a lost opportunity to put some fairly dense, if you put a dense mansion block type on top of that, that'll ameliorate the need for spire buildings or tall buildings, tower blocks, however you want to call them, elsewhere, and it'll provide opportunity for more family orientated and socially orientated housing. So I think that's a detail that might be included. So if we're agreed on that, so I've got a hand up. I can't, Hannah, can you identify who the hand is?
It's Councillor Jackson.
Can I
Councillor,
before we go
sorry,
to
Johnny first. Yeah.
I was wondering actually if John wanted to respond on the Sainsbury's point, because as I say, I want us to optimize housing in the most sensitive way possible. And if there are people who think that we can do that in different ways from how we're proposing, I want that to be interrogated.
I understood that it was a reticence on part of the supermarket, but
is that right, John?
Yes, definitely. I think it's a point well made. You're absolutely right. I don't think it was anticipated with this site that there wouldn't be the opportunity taken to use the area above the supermarket for residential purposes. And as you've said, that helps reduce the density elsewhere. So I don't think it's any reluctance on the part of the council to do that. And if we need to make it clearer in the SPD, or that's pointed out to us to make clear in the SPD, then I think it's a point that's a reasonable point, well made. But I hear what you say.
I think since we're having this conversation, if my fellow members are agreed, what I'm asking you to do is to include that point in your quick paper back to us, if John is agreeable to that, and that we will then make sure we make it part of our recommendation in the comments to the SPD. Is that all right, John? Is that the best way of the quickest way of doing it? I mean, I'm happy to do it a different way if that's not right, but Alison Jackson, are you with us, and would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Now, hold on. Before we go any further, in strict protocol terms, I've got to ask you as to whether you have any declaration of interest.
I don't. No, I'm totally clear.
No, good. I mean, it's just that you had a clash of meetings and you weren't there for that part of the agenda. So thank you for that. And Hannah, you'll make note of that, please. So, Alison, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, apologise for coming in so late. Unavoidable, I'm afraid, my end. But just on this Kensal and SPD, just a question on the kind of design aspects. I mean, obviously, design makes a community, the way it's designed. Is it designed as a village, or is it designed, in another way? And I suppose my question was, how many buildings are being, industrial buildings are being demolished, and how many are staying? Because I do think the industrial heritage is a very important one, and to retain the integrity of the area and the heritage of this area, and the designers and the architects for me are key, because it says in the SPT everything's going to be high quality. Well, I don't really know what that means, because I'm really talking about, really good designers and architects that are beyond, just sort of average, really, to make it a new and exciting place that could make a great place, a new place in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, rather than just something, housing's important, but that's got to be not just of high standard, because I'm sure the finishes and everything will be of high standard, but of high quality design standard. And I look at things like Lord's Cricket Ground, and I look at things at the National Portrait Gallery, where they're combining, or the National Gallery, where they've had combining old and new, and they've been hugely successful with those type of architects. And I haven't seen anything like that in Kensington or Chelsea, and I really would like to see, a really outstanding design in the architecture. And I think that would make a massive difference to the community, rather than, because ghost towns are not attractive and people just don't want to be there. Bethnal Green have had there's an uncohesive new design there, and it hasn't worked, and it was, sort of rolled out by sort of package developers, and I suppose that's my question. What are the thoughts on that, and what are the thoughts about retaining industrial heritage and making it into new fantastic special bespoke developments that provide good village hyperlocal community living?
Well, I completely agree with you, Alison, about the importance of design on a scheme this big. It's one of the things that I've told officers I really want to prioritise in the production of an SPD. I think actually you're probably right, and in some ways it would be good if it was more prescriptive about what good design means to this borough and to this council. There's obviously a delicate balance between being prescriptive and allowing a commercial outfit to develop their own land, and we're trying to tread that, but I do take that on board. I mean, one of the things that I've said to the landowners when I've spoken to them directly is that I want them to take Kensington and Chelsea as the relevant context, more so than sites in adjacent boroughs that might be geographically closer and of a different character. I don't think, for example, that Paddington Basin is a useful tool to develop Kensal through. And actually, one of the things I toyed with writing a forward to this SPD and starting it with "We don't want another Nine Elms," until I realised that the landowner is exactly the same as the one on Kensal, and it might not be my most diplomatic moment. So I shelved that, at least for the moment. But no, the point on design is absolutely well made, and one that I completely take. John, you can probably talk more to the number of buildings that are being demolished, and particularly industrial ones.
Can I just answer to Johnny though? Who decides on who are the architects and the designers and the whole look of a large section of the Royal Borough? Kensal in this instance. I mean, who are the deciders on that?
Well, we don't own the land, or rather, we're a very minor landowner. I think we do have one very small site on the eastern corner of the site, but the rest of it, John, I should think would be the landowner's decision, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. I mean, we can't get involved in who they select as architects and who they decide to take on board. I mean, sometimes, we have, I'm only speaking generally here, not about this particular site, but sometimes we do think that, developers don't always have the right architects for what they're doing. And, but we have to sort of say in a tactful way, is this really what you want? Is this really where you want to go? But it's not really up to us to decide. Really, we have to provide that guidance, and it's very clear that their decisions as to who they use to develop that are their decisions. We don't have any role over that, I'm afraid.
I think it's an interesting ideological question too, in the sense that, of course, as Conservatives, we're associated with the free market, and here is the free market, and clearly, because we are in the positions we are, there's an impulse towards state control, because as elected officials, we feel that we have a role to play in shaping development. And that is a natural tension. And I can think of at least one other site where we've asked to be more involved in the selection of architects and things, and that hasn't happened. So ultimately, generally, I think it is down to the developer, to the landowner, and our role in that way is fairly, small.
I think one of the complexities in that is also the fact that I have to declare an interest because I'm an architect. The architects work for clients, and they are given a brief to work to. So it does depend on the quality of architect, but it also depends on the quality of the brief, and how much the client will allow the architect to point out opportunities in the context for achieving more than the client can imagine. Within they may be very fixated on money and return and all that kind of stuff, but the architect might be able to point out that some of the best the most expensive buildings in the world are very often the ones that have been well designed and well built. And it depends a bit on what the brief is as to whether it's for a quick turn or for a lengthy legacy. So it is to do with the choice of architect, I agree, but it's also to do with the interpretation, with the setting of the brief by the client. And I think that the thing that where we do have a connection with the client is the purpose of the SPD and the planning system is to help guide the setting of that brief. So I don't think we can say that we're cut out of the process, because we are involved in the process and we do set guidelines. And we set ambitions in this SPD. We talk about culture of Kensington Chelsea, the spatial forms, the design quality, the quality of the environment, the quality of communities, and so on.
I think where we're cut out is in the selection of the architects, but you're right, we have a role to play in shaping all of this. And to be fair, this is a balance, and if the committee has a strong view that we need to be more prescriptive to accommodate Alison's points, and if there's a feeling in the community, then that is the kind of thing that can be reshaped. It's all a judgment.
I mean, that's why I thought, for instance, to digress slightly, the Brompton SPD was so strong, because it did address the typography, it did address the functionality, the building types, etc. But it also addressed the financial viability of the site in a very detailed way, and showed that those types of uses that the community wanted to preserve their social community in that context were actually written into a very successful generic analysis of how that might fight its corner against the normal assumption of sort of buy-to-leave private housing with a few social housing on the side. And it was a strong SPD from that particular aspect, I think. And perhaps we could sharpen up on some of the analysis here, because I think that Rob Brompton SPD could teach us a few things that we could inject into our other SPDs. I mean, there's lots of strength in this paper, but I think the Brompton had some other strengths. Anyway, I think I've said enough, and what I'd like personally to do is to ask Jonathan to pull that brief back to us, and it was particularly on the sustainability of the sustainable, that we are building sustainable community here. And I think that from what Portia and Charlie and Alison have brought forward, those are all elements of that, and they're in the setting of the stage for this SPD as well on there. So, Alison, sorry, did I cut you off? Did you want to ask a supplementary?
Yeah, no, it was just, I agree with you on the Brompton SVT actually, because I thought that was actually excellent and more detailed. And I just wanted to just follow up on the shaping and the guiding of the brief and that element of our communication and connection with the people who own the land, because I think that it involves, if it's not designed nicely, I can't think of the right word, well, it's not going to encourage people to have a nice community or a good community. And so I think that guidance is hugely important if there's anything you can do on that.
Okay, I think we've probably had enough discussion on this paper. We've set a target for a quick paper, Jonathan, please, because we want to work within your consultation process, and we needed to come back to us in time for us to discuss it as a committee. We don't have a full meeting before then, but we'll need to circulate it to the committee, agree a contribution to the SPD response as a committee, and to be reassured that the correct balance, as Johnny's put it, has been. And I appreciate this is a very difficult situation, and I also appreciate the, if you like, the overarching threat of a mayoral involvement taking away any guidance that we can give. But we also need to be very reassured that those that come after us are happy that we made the best possible decision in a difficult situation, in the interest of the community that will live there. So thank you very much on that one for council. And if we could then move on to the next paper, which is A6. Now, before we get on to A6, I'd like to make a brief comment because we're shifting away from sort of street management and then planning into the carbon zero 2030 commitment, because I think all the other reports fall into that generic. Now, the message that's come out from our investigations in previous committee meetings and the work we've done between have come back to a number of issues with regards to 2030. I think that it would be fair to say that there is a lot of good stuff happening across the council. All departments, the Sustainability Board, and a whole number of people, lead practitioners like Doug Goldring and others who've been addressing this at pace. But that word pace is very important because the reality is that we as a council have not just set a target of 2030, we've actually made a commitment with regards to all of our operations as a council. Now, a commitment is different because it's hard-edged, it's not deferrable. Unless the council itself makes a decision to to shift that target or that objective, it is an absolute one. It's not one that can be finessed by select committees, dare I say it, or policymakers or executive directors or leadership teams or and so on. Unless they go back for a change of what the council has decided. So it's a very unusual situation. The reality that comes from that is that we had a 10-year program to achieve it, and not just to plan it or to have aspirations, but to actually bag it and get it done. And that required a certain cadence. And the most obvious one is the housing one, and that's over 50% of the carbon footprint as analysed by Ether and others, which comes as no surprise to those who've been practicing this area prior. But the pace needed to hit a certain number per year to achieve the overall target. Now, we are 18 months into that original commitment out of 10 years. So you could say that we've got about 8.5 years left. And therefore the pace, or rather the cadence per annum, is going up as we don't yet have anything done on the ground. It would be unreasonable to expect it all to start on day one, but we need to pay attention to the annual cadence. There is also a question mark on some of the resources being brought to bear, and we'll come back to that in later papers. And then out of work like the Lanc West, we've got some practicality issues coming up, like the training of labour to install a window. Sounds a very easy thing to do in the construction industry, but to do it in a damp-proof and draft-proof way has proven difficult on even the Lanc West pilot project. To find contractors who are actually able to do this in practice and then have it tested to show that it really works. So in addition to that, we have today reinforcement by the news that instead of a 2050 national target for national carbon neutrality, the 78% of that target is to be brought forward to 2035, which is a frighteningly ambitious arrangement, but I suppose it's the sort of thing that one would expect prior to an international climate change conference in the UK. If that's put into practice and given sufficient resources, that will tighten up on the time frame of what we have to do as a council and as a society. And the final point to make is that this whole area of 2030 achievement, the commitment to that, has now been registered on the risk register under the Audit and Transparency Committee, and it was referred to that by the executive management team, I understand, which is a very good sign that the coffee is being smelt everywhere. But it'll become a formal audit item in the council audit in time to come, because it'll go on the next iteration of the risk register, and then it will be taken as a factor in the audit in probably a year's time or so. So those are sort of backcloth issues which basically sharpen up the whole area of 2030. So if we could then move on to this paper of A6, which is advice for conservation in conservation areas. I very much welcome this paper. I think there are two particular areas, and I'll be asking the first question on this. So first of all, thank you very much, officers, for the report, and to Amanda in particular, thank you, and your officer team. The question you ask is that, do we agree as a committee that the normal practice of doing advice for conservation areas, appraisals or whatever, excuse me, I'll have to take a break. It's normally done on a ward by ward basis, and the proposal here is to take certain generic issues, technical in particular, as a generic paper across all wards. So advice, for instance, on how we can upgrade glazing, I think would be a priority in conservation areas, as such issues as double glazing or secondary glazing and so on, in a conservation context. Because I think this is particularly important to address, because particularly as we work towards the 2040 objectives of the whole council, the whole borough's carbon neutrality. There are large areas of the borough which are conservation, with traditional construction with sash windows and such like, where there needs to be a big technical upgrade, but at the same time sensibility towards conservation. And I think that, bluntly, I think that as good as the advice is at the moment, there needs to be further work done, bearing in mind some new technologies that are coming on board, to work with the English Heritage and come up with some type examples, case studies or design guides that would be useful. So I think that the generic approach of providing some cross-ward advice would be extremely useful. I think it's also will be good advice to be used outside conservation areas as well, where people may not strictly have to conform in such a tight way, but would like to be able to. There are plenty of non-conservation houses which are of merit. So I think I would like just to say general welcome. agree with a structure and a focus, particularly on how glazing it should be upgraded as one of the generics that you should address. Now, that's my input. I've got a hand up. Again, I can't read who that is. Hannah, could you help me?
It's Councillor Oretti.
Councillor Oretti, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. It's not a question really, Chairman. I mean, I think I just want to echo what you said about the glazing thing. Firstly, it's all a various number of problems. I mean, firstly, the heat loss. Secondly, the sound pollution, where a lot of residents in my ward are facing on Holland Road, especially because obviously because of the appearance, they can't have a double glazing. So I welcome this report, but I really want to see some work being done, and so that we could advise our residents, our owners, to replace the windows that would satisfy the conservation area, and it's not detrimental to the appearance of our area. So really welcome that report, but I really want to see some work being done, because obviously there's huge material advancements and technology that could really create glazing which wouldn't affect the appearance of the building. So it would definitely a huge benefit, especially the sound pollution, because obviously glazing would reduce the sound penetration into the homes. So I really love to see some work being done. Thank you.
Anybody else like to ask? Thank you very much, Arian. Anybody else like to ask a question? If not, I'll try to summarize in a recommendation, if I may. If a committee has agreed, could we adopt a recommendation that firstly agrees to the generic subject approach that's been proposed in this paper? So in other words, there will be a combination of local ward conservation area advice combined with generic ones which would address particular subjects. So that would be the first part. The second part of the recommendation would be that we would ask that officers and lead member look at, in the first instance, that there be a generic report, not the only generic report, but the one that we see as the highest priority is addressing the upgrading of glazing, both thermally and as Councillor Oretti has said, acoustically as well, but upgrading the technical quality of glazing in the conservation context. And that allied with that, I think that we do need to go beyond the conventional wisdom that's there at the moment and re-engage in the discussion with both English heritage and our leading amenity societies. I mean, for example, like the Kensington Society and the Chelsea Society, but obviously there are more local ones than that. I suppose Ladbroke, Esser, and so on, and the Cracker in the south. So my proposed recommendation is thus. So is everybody agreed to that? Anybody got a problem or a further question on that? If not, could we adopt that as a recommendation on this paper? And unless the lead member or officers would like to come back on that particular paper, perhaps we could move on. So anybody else like to comment? Or are we happy to move on? Okay, thank you. The next paper, I believe, are there going to be some slides with this one as well? Hannah.
Hello, Councillor Pascal. My name's Caroline Scott. I was just going to do 3 quick slides of a summary of what was in the paper.
I'd just like to say thank you for the paper, welcome, and perhaps you could take us through your slides. That'd be great.
Thank you. I'm just going to take brilliant. So the first slide is just a reminder of actually what's already been referenced to a couple of minutes ago in terms of the scale of the challenge for housing, and that housing accounts for more than 50% of the emissions in our borough. And obviously, but that's thinking about council operation emissions. It's not, you know, when you think about the social housing in the borough, it's a smaller proportion of the whole housing in the borough. Can I go to the next slide, please? So setting out some of the scale of the challenge and what we're starting to do, we're quite early in the programme on this. So the estimated costs of bringing RBKC housing to net zero is almost 97 million. And you can see the giant number there of 2.5 billion for the whole of the borough. That's clearly linked to a need for us to source funding. There's challenges there for us in terms of we have applied for some funding and been successful in some areas and been unsuccessful in other areas. Key challenges really are the timescales for delivery. So some of the central government grants are really targeted at private sector housing, and that then so their delivery timescales are quite short. And obviously, when we're looking at our housing, we need to approach it on a block by block basis. So that means our lead-in timescales, because we need to do open and transparent consultation and then deliver on a large scale, means often we can't make their timescales. But we are planning for future funding opportunities. So round 3 of the GHG LAD funding stream opens in June, and we're already, although we don't have the final criteria yet, we're planning and preparing for that. And there's another bid that we're looking at as well, in partnership with many teams across the council, which is in terms of future communities for 2030. The good news is Lancaster West Estate has already secured approximately £21 million, which is brilliant. But that also presents a challenge because quite a lot of that work relates to innovative work. And internally in the council, there are new funding streams coming online, and housing will obviously be seeking some support from those. Separate to that, housing has got a large-scale capital works programme, and we're into year 2 on that. Some projects that we're having to deliver now, an example would be if a heating system was failing, we might not be able to put in the greenest solution immediately, because what we need to have is reliable and efficient heating for our tenants. We've mapped the energy ratings of all our properties. So of 9,500 properties, we're aiming to get them all to EPC rating C. Currently 2,000 are at D and approximately 250 are E, F and G. So we have a way to go. We're planning intrusive insulation surveys, so you can't see the quality and the quantity of insulations in walls, and some of our roofs need to be accessible. But better news is that in terms of the capital programme, replacement glazing and roofing solutions are included within that. Historically, we haven't got great data, but we have done a baseline in partnership with our climate change team. That's given us a really good starting point, and that's enabled us to estimate the costs that we need to bring our stock to net zero. One of our first projects is a smart metering project, so getting smart meters into the meters that we control, so that's the communal areas. And obviously it's up to individual tenants and leaseholders to seek smart meters for their own properties. And similarly, that's kind of important in relation to the consumption data. We have it for communal areas, but tenants and leaseholders have their own billing, own bills, like we all do. And that's going to be quite useful information, though, in terms of actual consumption from individual properties. And there's a lot of opportunity for us to learn there. And a smaller number of our properties don't have individual heating controls, but that's being addressed through the capital programme as well. And that will enable those properties to become more efficient. And on to the next slide. So new build, it can cost more to build greener. Obviously, you've just been listening to about planning SPDs there, and specifications that we've got out there are balancing cost and carbon. But our big challenge is the retrofitting. That, for the UK, getting new build right is hugely important, but the retrofitting of our current properties is hugely important. Historically, we've lacked expertise, specifically in relation to energy engineering, but we have a new energy manager in post within housing. We're recruiting an officer. And linked to the bullet below on large-scale technology, So the funding that we've secured for Lanc West Estate has enabled us to utilise consultants, and some of those consultants are the experts that have worked on other London exemplars. So that's really helpful for us. In Europe, this large-scale technology is really common. In the UK, it's not, and in London, it's not. And Lancaster West's work is the pilot for us that we're hoping to replicate in housing. And so they're assessing the feasibility of ground and air source heat pumps and decentralised energy networks which utilise waste heat. Behavioural change is probably the biggest challenge because it's a challenge for all of us. We've all got to think about what we consume, be that and what we buy, be it in the energy that we use or the way we travel or the waste that we generate. And that is a big challenge that I think the nation is working on, and will be working with our sister departments across the council to address that. And lastly, just to offer some assurance on governance. So internally, we have our Housing Net Zero Board that meets every month. And we also have a task and finish group with our tenants and leaseholders in relation to the sustainability and fuel poverty strategy. That's my quick run through of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Marwan, you were going to ask the first question on this, I believe. Sorry, I apologize. Hold on a minute, Marwan. Does the lead member want to say anything on this at all first? Caroline's led off on this, but do we have any lead member involvement at this stage?
Well, just very briefly, and just first of all to thank Caroline. I think she's covered all the main salient points as far as the paper is concerned. I think I really just wanted to record the success on the funding that we have got for the Lancaster West Estate. I think that's a great credit to the team and for the Residents Association, the residents of Lanc West that have been able to do that, because this is giving us quite a unique opportunity. I mean, apart from the additional works on the estate, towards our objective of creating a model 21st century estate, it is going to allow us to gather a lot of information and a lot of experience on greening our old buildings, because as Caroline says, I mean, the average age of our housing stock is 1960s. So it is going to be a big challenge, but I think that gives us a great opportunity, to set us for how we might use that both within the borough, within our own housing stock within the borough, but also I think most important, as Caroline's referred to, educating our other residents as well in terms of what the opportunities are in order to green their homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. And Marwan, I'm sorry I cut you off because I'd forgotten to ask Kim to speak, but we should have allowed him to speak first without going to you. So, Marwan, if you'd like to ask the first question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Caroline, for this overall view about this paper and the ambitious objective to reach carbon neutrality by 2030 and the involvements of different states. And no, I'm very pleased for Councillor Taylor-Smith saying the model being developed in my ward now on Lancaster West Estate. I've just came from that meeting where they were installing now a new substation, and what I was very pleased about is the involvement of the resident association, and this will bring me to the behavioral change as highlighted by the challenge facing us in order to alter the behavior in terms of energy consumption. So I think there is a clear message there need to be articulated for our residents to be energy conscious. So this is a challenge which I would like to see some figures on uptaking later. But on the paper, if I can say, for example, on the clarification on some points, like for example, 1.1, there is a mention of a new transformative approach and rethinking. Are you referring to any digital platforms there or engagement of different sort in that statement? The other thing I would like to ask is the alleviation of fuel poverty in our borough, which is a key ambition on 1.6. Is there any figures, timeline, where we can see a trend in reduction of that? And you answered the question which I already highlighted to ask in 1.7, how you are going to improve your data, having no clear data, and you highlighted that in your brief presentation on establishing the baseline for performance monitoring. So this is my main questions for this paper, and thank you so much regarding the overall view, which has answered some of the key issues I was going to raise. So thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Would the officers or Kim, would you like either of you to come back? Kim,
I'm very
first.
happy to let Caroline answer the question.
Okay,
Thank you.
Caroline.
Okay, thank you. So on data, it is a good question, and I think I mentioned that historically we haven't had great data, but we're starting to collate that data, and we've done, in partnership with the climate change team, quite detailed modelling, and that modelling has been tried and tested in many locations, and it's based on absolute specifics of those buildings. So in terms of the year they were built, the type of wall construction, the level of insulation, the type of heating system that's in there. So obviously we've got a wide and varied housing stock that's been built across many decades, and at different times we had different building regulations that had different requirements for all sorts of I mean, how much, I think when it was the late 70s that cavity walls started having to be filled, things like that. So that we're building that data and we're learning about our stock. I mean, we've had our stock for a number of years, but it's a journey to go on in terms of the absolute specifics of which technology will work in which types of properties. In terms of a transformative approach, I think that is where we look to Lancaster West Estate, and the feasibility studies that we've got going on there are for large scale energy that is not common in London. And I think it's right for us to pilot it before we try and roll out on an even bigger scale, because Lancaster West is a large estate, and anything that works on an estate of that size will then be replicable across our borough. In terms of fuel poverty, I don't actually hold that data, but we do have I do have colleagues in the council who do have that and have a programme in terms of tackling fuel poverty. And corporately, we have the Green Doctor scheme that will go out and visit residents and identify opportunities for greening homes and saving money. The capital programme, together with the work that we do towards net zero, will go a long way to tackling fuel poverty. So I would expect to see that data and trends going forwards. But realistically, because a lot of the work is going to be very large scale, a lot of that data isn't going to be available in the early years. So I expect to see those timelines and trends coming, but we don't have that information right now. We have a lot of work to do before we're going to start seeing the benefits, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Chair.
And
Thank
thank you, Marwan. Now, Hannah, could you help me again? I've got another hand up. I can't see who it is.
That's Anka.
Anka, would you like to make a contribution?
Yes, thank you very much, Councillor. Hello, everyone. It's Anka Georgiou, Sustainability Projects Manager. Just to follow on Ka's points regarding fuel poverty. So as part of the climate change team, we have been running a fuel poverty program for more than 5 years, and we've been supporting more than 600 residents who are suffering of fuel poverty. So basically, we receive national data in terms of the fuel poverty in London and also on the borough. We don't really know the fuel poverty dates on estates, for example, but we know the areas across the borough that have the highest level of fuel poverty, and I can share them after the meeting. So the Homes for Health and the Green Doctors program have been directly supporting residents through a number of services, through direct visits, giving them energy advice, installing small energy efficiency measures, giving them debt advice, helping them to switch their energy supplier, and then referring them to other services. So there are other grants available that residents can actually benefit for larger energy efficiency measures. And this has been quite a successful program, and residents have been welcoming. And it's a free service that we have been securing through external funding. So we have external funding. We had external funding in the last 3 years from National Grid. The funding is running to an end this year, but we are looking again to continue the program, and we're looking at other funding going forward. And on top of that, we have another big fuel poverty program as part of the Green Homes Grant local authority delivery scheme, and this is mainly targeting the private rented sector, and it's supporting residents who are on low income, below 30K, and living in EF&G, so poor rated properties. So I think this is kind of giving an overview of the fuel poverty program, but I'm happy to share any details or data after the meeting.
Thank you, Anka, very much. Does anybody else on the committee wish to raise a question, either of the lead member officers at this point? If not, could I summarise? Sorry?
Something just came to mind. The officer, thanks for your detailed report. Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the detailed report, and I think it's very interesting and impressive. However, something just popped to mind. You know, when a leaseholder, rent a council building from us, from the organisation, whose carbon footprint it is? When the council leases out one of our properties to an organisation, whose carbon footprint it is?
Right, Kim, would you like to address this question?
So just to clarify, obviously, are we talking about leaseholders who exercise their right to buy, because obviously it becomes their own home? And
when we rent, it could be both. It could be lease to buy or to rent.
Okay, well, if it's a leaseholder and a council property, obviously it is their responsibility, and it's rather like any owner of any property within the borough. If it's a housing association where we have nomination rights, again, it's the responsibility of the housing association. And again, we need to lobby and cajole them in order to follow our lead. Obviously, if they are a leaseholder and maybe in a block, then obviously we do have the control in terms of large elements of what that heating might be, like, for instance, the provision of a district heating system and works that we might do to green the building. But what goes on within their own home in terms of, use of gas hobs, etc., is obviously something that is within their overall control.
So it's their own
it's a bit mix and it's a little bit mix and match, because obviously we have the ability to do work on the building, so we can green the building. And obviously the leaseholders have a right to question in terms of the cost we're doing with. But what goes on behind their door is down to them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
That's a very good question, Portia, and it was certainly one that I was going to include in my summary. So thank you very much for raising it in the first instance.
Thank you, Chair.
Have we covered questions? Because I'd like to try to summarize with a recommendation. I think it's, in my book, it's got 4 elements, partly from what I thought beforehand and partly from the paper and partly from what we've discussed. The first point is, and Caroline, you did put forward stuff on the slides, but I have to say that I'm still a little bit confused about what is and isn't included in a number of the elements of what would be considered normal maintenance, the sort of capital program upgrade, the carbon 30 specific stuff, because I know that from discussions in previous briefings, that some of what we have to do by carbon 2030 is included in existing housing budgets and some is not. So my first recommendation is that the shortfall of money that is required to take our housing stock to C 2030 zero. I would like that, if possible, to be fed through to Taryn Eve's work under paper A9, which we're going to come on later on. I don't mean fed through tonight, but I think that there needs to be some clarification. In very round terms, Kim, you're going to correct me on this, but very round terms, after your briefing to councillors on the council housing programme, I had the impression that we were about 200 million short. By the time we got to the budget meeting, I thought that the insulation provision of 100 million would cut that down at least by half. And so there seems to be, to get to the full end stop of completing the substitution of alternatives to current generation boilers, etc., whether it be to heat pumps or to some kind of hydrogen input boiler in the future, if one's to believe some of the studies that are going on. And then also possibly, if we can't get there, there's going to have to be some form of carbon tax or input after that, offset or something of that sort. But anyway, the first part of the recommendation is that whatever work needs to be done to make sure that the financial shortfall is identified and fed through to the summation of the overall carbon neutral 2030 target shortfall, crossing all the sectors, should be fed into Taryn Eve's work, which he's been doing with support of Anka, Giorgio and others. The second part is what you've just raised, Portia, thank you for raising it, is that I think that there needs to be an addressing of some of the detailed issues with regard to the implications of achieving 2030 on the council's stock, which includes leaseholders because we're the landlord. And as far as I understand it, if a capital improvement is done to a block or a hereditamент that is leased, that is then passed on to the leaseholder. Now, if we're talking about a chunky upgrade, the cost per unit is going to be big and difficult for leaseholders who are not particularly well financed to absorb in a short period. So how is this going to be addressed? Because at the extreme, we're either going to have no money coming in from leaseholders except over a period. Alternatively, we're going to have leaseholders who are going to have to default on their leases because they've broken their conditions under their covenant. So this is an issue which I think that needs to be addressed. I don't know the exact scale of the implications, and I don't know the best way to address it. That's for others to obviously address. But I think it's an area that we as a committee should ask to be looked at, and some sort of conversation or some indication as to how it will be addressed with leaseholders, obviously, but also in relation to the council's finance. The third area for recommendation would be that I think it starts off with a welcome of the Fabric First approach, because this is the most technically robust and socially robust way of spending money towards the 2030 objective. To put it bluntly, if you can't afford any fuel, you'll be warmer if you have a well-insulated property. You will not be warmer if you have a heat pump because you can't afford to run it. And therefore the starting, and it's a well-matured and understood technology, and one that most of the construction industry with a bit of supervision should be able to address. The areas such as transforming from boilers to heat pumps or to some alternative form of boiler, it is exciting to look at and technically possible, and Lankwest are addressing this directly. But it is true to say that if you talk to the average plumber in the street, he's heard of a heat pump. He may have a client who wants one researched, but he probably hasn't installed it. It may be called air conditioning. And when you look at the maintenance cost and life expectancy and noise generation of the average air conditioning plant, that are in shops and better off domestic properties and so on. There are a lot of issues to be solved before one could say that one has a full maturation of that as a technical way to go. It's the way we're going to have to go, but it is going to have some learning curve on the way, and therefore we need to be aware of that. So we think that it's an area that needs to be looked into. Lessons from LackWest and other work, lessons from other parties who've been involved in this, but looking at the time frame for the maturity. I mean, heat pumps are expensive to maintain, and we don't yet know their efficacy in detail. I think the fourth area was touched on to do with fuel poverty, which, the Fabric First, as I say, addresses to a large degree. It's definitely the best way to go. But how far that approach works in practice, as was raised by Marwan earlier on, depends on understanding the data with regard to behavioural change, understanding by occupants as to how to run their properties, and to measurement, at least of a sample of in some way of the practical performance and over time. So if we could make I'm putting it to my committee members, if we could make a recommendation in 4 parts, which is that we ask officers to make sure that any shortfall on resources is identified through to the financial area of work, which we're summarising under A9. Secondly, that we look at, that the area, not we look at, that the area of the implications for leaseholders is researched in some detail. And I know, Kim, from your work on fire precautions and so on, you have done an extensive amount of work on this and how to carry these things out, how to address some very difficult issues in terms of profiling costs and giving people engagement and involvement. I think the assumption that heat pumps will work on a mass exercise need to be tested. They may well, the industry may well respond very quickly, but we just need to be sure of that in reality. And the fuel poverty issue and the behavioural change is the fourth one. So, Hannah, have you got a note of those?
Yes.
Hold on a minute. Let me just check with Hannah first, and I'll come back to you, Kim. Hannah, have you got a note of what I've said?
Yes, Chair. So
before we agree or not amongst ourselves, Kim, you wanted to come back with a supplement.
Yeah, just a point of clarification, Mr. Chairman, and a little bit of background. So first of all, as far as leaseholders are concerned, leaseholders don't pay for improvements, they pay for repairs. And that is obviously something that, as far as the capital programme is concerned, then we've factored into the capital programme a recovery from leaseholders based upon an estimate. I think we have to record that the scale of our capital programme now, I mean, bearing in mind that our initial estimate was 120 million and now we're up to 427 million, has significantly increased. And so consequently, the burden as far as the leaseholder is concerned is again going to be quite high. And that's something we're obviously going to have to work with our leaseholders in terms of how we support them on that. So I think that's the first point. So, and that because obviously it has to be funded through the HRA, the financing of that is resulting that really, instead of looking initially at a much shorter period of capital improvement, we're having to extend that capital improvement. And I think we're now looking at maybe over about 7 years. So when we factor in a further £95 million, which obviously you're recommending we build out into the finances, we are going to have to look very carefully at how that is going to be phased. And you only have to work 7 years on 2021 to see, that that's taking us up to 2028, just in terms of addressing the issues of repair within our stock. So our wriggle room is extremely tight on this. And obviously, if you are asking me what is the most important thing, putting in triple glazed windows or giving somebody a decent heating system at low flow, those are the challenges that we're obviously going to have to look at. And I think obviously I'll just ask the committee, to consider that when looking at its recommendation. But it's not going to be an easy fix on this one. We already know that this is going to require a great difficulty, a great expense, a lot of innovation and a lot of hard work as well. And so I just really want to make that point. But clearly we are determined that we want to do our bit in achieving carbon zero, recognising that the council housing stock of 9,500 compares to the 75,000 homes that we have within the borough.
Kim, I first of all, I'd like to say to you and through you to all your officers that I think that this is the area of the council's work on this subject that we're looking at as scrutiny, which is the largest, the most difficult, and has issues, as you say, of pace and cadence and timescale. So, but as I said in my preliminary remarks to the carbon zero part of this agenda, the screw is tightening from outside as well as the commitment that we put on ourselves in council. So I think you have a very big mountain to climb, you and officers, and I think you're doing extremely well. I think that all we can do in our recommendations is to, in effect, help recognise the issues, some of the issues that we see as focal points, and to encourage you to continue to address those. We can't set your policy or anything of that sort. That's for you and your officers or for you to set the policy and for officers to carry it out. But I think here in those 4 points I was making is that I think that that we can perhaps shine a light on from a different perspective the things that we see as coming to the surface as priorities. These are not meant to be critical. They're meant to be observational in a large degree and to be supportive and so on as well.
They're not taken as critical, certainly. Yeah. I welcome the advice.
Yeah. Now, two questions. Well, I asked Hannah if Hannah, you've got a note of what I said. We'll refine the wording, obviously, in a draft afterwards. But members of this committee, are you happy that you've asked the questions you want to ask on this paper? Are you happy with the recommendations that I proposed? And are you happy to agree them now so that we can move on to the next paper? I get no response. So is that okay? Good. Thank you very much. And thank you, Kim, and thank you to your officers, both those present and also to those who've been advising us on previous occasions. Thank you very much indeed. And I think you have the biggest task in the Carbon 30 agenda, so well done. Moving on to A8. This is a paper which I need to reiterate before coming to this. I'm Chairman of Governors at Marlborough Primary School, which is mentioned in this paper. I'll come back to that at the end, but I'm not going to lead on this discussion. Marwan, well, first of all, officers, is there Officer President Ian Turner, are you here?
Yes, I'm here, Chairman.
We have read your. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you for your paper. We have had it circulated. We have all are expected to have read it. So there's no need for you to take us through the paper in detail. But are there any particular issues that you'd like to draw to our attention initially? And that I will then move on to Councillor Marwan Nagi to come up with the first question. So, Ian, first of all, is there anything you'd like to highlight initially?
A very few points, if I may, Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity. As members will know, the Council has invested a significant amount of money in the last 12 years in either building new schools or rebuilding or extending schools, and each time that has been done, clearly carbon issues have been a significant issue to address within the design. In the coming years, I think the things that we need to look at are first of all making sure that we understand our stock, which is why we're suggesting that we revise the condition and suitability survey programme to include carbon neutral issues rather more specifically, and to use two pilot schemes to focus our attention and our method of addressing these issues. Now, I want to say, if it's not clear enough in the paper, why it is we chose these two. Coalville is a Victorian board school, and there are significant issues that are common to a number of other Victorian board schools, which we need to analyse further in terms of how to address carbon neutrality. Marlborough is a new school, relatively, last few years, and we may ask ourselves why we would choose a school such as that, given its newness. Well, the issue is that some of the modern control mechanisms are actually quite difficult for lay people to operate. If you're an engineer, you might find it easier, but we need to address the fact that schools like Marlborough may not be performing as well as they could, simply because the control systems are not understood. So those would be our two pilot surveys. And then we need to go through the process of using the capital that we do have available to us in the most appropriate way when it comes to repairs and renewals, working with the climate change team, as we have done for several years, to continue to drive down carbon production. And to encourage, and I think this is really important, to encourage schools to do something that people were referring to earlier in this meeting, and that is to think carefully about their own usage and their own behaviour, and how to ensure that they are, by doing so, reducing the carbon footprint. I'm personally very keen on air quality monitors in schools because I think they tell teachers a lot that they might not have understood. But those are our key points, Chairman. I hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful indeed. Thank you. Marwan, Councillor Marwan and Nagi, would you like to ask the first question here?
Actually, I answered almost, Ian. Thanks, Ian, for this paper and for this clarification. I think you answered part of them, especially coming. Okay, I will. I'm very pleased that you acknowledged that the operation of new technology in order to achieve certain targets, that's these modern schools, that the operation is not properly implemented as you would like to be. But what mechanism do we have in place for this to continue? What kind of assurance we can get in order, or feedback for you to monitor this operation in order to support schools to reduce their energy, and what kind of support will be available to those schools. And the other thing is about the measurement of the efficiency over time. I mean, for example, today, for the last year, we have the pandemic. Most schools are unoccupied. There are other factors involved. So how do you incorporate this in your measurement? And the other things, the final one is about behavior, again, as we highlighted earlier in the previous section regarding behavioral change. For example, I'm very pleased to see that you shed some light on the climate change topics, which is being featured in the curriculum for the recent years for students and teachers to be more engaged and aware of. Is there any progress on supporting schools in that domain through like assemblies or workshops, or even engaging students to monitor their own energy consumption in schools, as well as you mentioned, air quality control as a lesson to be learned? Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Ian, is there anything you want to come back on that, or shall I move on to the next question?
One or 2 points I would make. Yes, thank you, Chair. Part of the process of the pilot scheme will be to understand exactly what the issues are with the operation of these complex systems, and therefore thereafter to put in some training and support for those people who use them. And we do have people on the council who, or in the council staff, who are very expert in these sorts of areas and can help that. But the first thing we need to do is to understand the issues, and we can go back to the main contractor, who is extremely supportive, and ask for further advice and guidance on the systems. In terms of the efficiency of buildings, I think the climate change team are very good at analysing efficiency, and we will work with them further to do that, and I'm sure we will make progress. And in terms of training and support for schools, well, this is an ongoing issue, and clearly we need to be developing further the training and support. But again, we'll do so in conjunction with the climate change team, and I'm confident that we will make significant progress.
Thank you, Ian. I have another hand that's got up.
Thank you, Chair.
Is that Anchors? Anchor, have you put your hand up?
Yes, thank you very much. Just to follow on Ian's points, and just to add that, as Ian mentioned, we have been working closely as part of the climate change team with Children's Services. So we have a list of all the community and denominational schools, and we track their consumption, energy consumption, and we receive that on a yearly basis. We know the schools that have the highest sources of emissions, and we try to support those schools. And this is how we've kind of developed our energy efficiency program in schools. So the schools that are the biggest, for example, in terms of buildings, the schools that they have the highest sources of emissions. And in terms of education, we have been offering climate change assemblies and sustainability assemblies in schools, and we have been working with a local charity called UrbanWise to support both teachers and also young people. And also we are organizing a yearly children's parliament on the environment. And again, it's just to raise awareness and to make sure that we're engaging pupils and embed climate change in the curriculum. But again, just to emphasize, we do have and we do monitor data, and we normally address all these issues as part of the carbon performance monitoring and the yearly carbon performance reports that we submit.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the committee have a?
Thank you, Anka.
Any other members of the committee have a question to ask on this paper? If not, could I summarise perhaps as follows? I think the first thing that I would like to say is that I think the lessons that will be learnt from what Ian is carrying out as work needs to be promulgated, spread, shared with other schools as soon as possible. Even early days feedback would be good, because I know from school where I'm chairman of governors that the controls, as Ian has pointed out, is a very important area. But I also know that on some of the older Victorian schools that understanding perhaps more basic controls and how to use them is also important. So lessons should be, as soon as they become available, if we could recommend that they're spread and discussed with other schools. This is not a piece of work limited just to 2 schools. This is a piece of work where work in progress already with 2 schools needs to be shared with others as soon as is available to communicate. Secondly, this whole area of behavioural change. I think that if engaged in the right way, we'll find that the children, even in primary schools, will be pushing not only their teachers, but their schools advisors and so on, perhaps harder than anybody, because those children are the children who are going to have to live with climate change more than any of us adults. The appetite for being engaged in this area, I think, is enormous, and that's why I think, Anka, what you suggested about a children's assembly on the environment is a brilliant idea, and one that, if I may, follow up outside this meeting. The third thing was Ian, I think we'd like to recommend that you have a look at as the emerging picture of costs that is going to impinge on your budgets. I mean, I know this will be a very diverse picture depending on the schools, because some of it will be to do with training and knowing how, and some of it will be to do with real physical work and expense. But as soon as you have some idea, and maybe you have an idea already, of an estimate of how to get your cohort of schools to carbon zero, to make sure that the financial implications of that are fed through to the area that we are going to discuss in the next paper under A9 with Taryn and Anka, to do with the financial implications of C030. And the fourth one, final one, is that it would be good if there could be a further report on progress in this field next year to this select committee. I don't know what the best timing would be. I think officers and lead members should choose that timing or advise on that timing, but maybe later in the autumn would be a good timescale, because I know you're doing a lot of work at the moment, and you've probably got a better perspective by the time we get to October, November time in this year. So again, Hannah, first, before I go to anybody else, Hannah, have you got a record of what I've just said?
Yes, Chair.
Good. Now, Ian, are you happy with those recommendations from a?
I'm very happy with those indeed. Thank you very much. Yes.
Because I think that it would be true to say that as hard as you work on this, your pace on it is constrained by other workload, finances, time of the day, your ability to get through the mountain of stuff. So we hope to support you in this endeavour as well as challenge you.
Thank you very much.
So is everybody agreed with those recommendations for A8? In which case, I'd like to thank Ian Turner, and I would also, Ian, if you could pass on thanks in two directions. One is, first of all, to lead member Josh Rendell, who I know was thoroughly briefed on this but was unable to come tonight, and I had his apology for that. So if you could just feedback that we welcome the paper, welcome your contribution, and if you like, the only thing is basically to encourage you to carry on but faster, and be supported in doing so. And then if you could also pass on to your colleagues, both towards Ian Heggs and team, and also to people who work with you in the more technical areas, thanks for the work you're doing. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman.
A9. Now, this paper is on the financial implications of achieving carbon neutrality and achieving 2030 overall, which is why I've referred to it a bit from a couple of other papers, because this needs to feed from a range of footprints, as exemplified by the ETHA report. I suppose housing is obviously the biggest one. Leisure and schools and so on are pretty big as well. Buildings tend to dominate the whole picture in a very, very big way. So first of all, welcome to the paper. And Taryn, I believe that you headed up this paper with considerable involvement from Anka, if that's correct. If you would like to highlight any particular points at this stage before we go into questioning.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think Mary Will's on the line as well, so she might also want to say something afterwards.
I apologise. I didn't know Mary Will was here. So Mary, I apologise for not calling you first. I should have called you first.
Taryn is so much better at this than I am, but I will have a little word afterwards.
Okay, so you want to go Taryn first, then you.
I'm very happy to do it that way, definitely.
Okay, well, I'm very happy to whichever way around. You're both very talented, so thank you. Taryn, yours, floor.
Thank you, Chair. And I guess what I should say first of all is that the report is twofold. So I think, it's a joint report by myself and Quinn-Terry. So I think the first part does provide a summary of the recent work that was commissioned, the Carbon Neutrality Pathways report. So I think there may be some questions on that. I suppose the second part of the paper, and we've touched on finances actually as part of the last two items that have come through, absolutely kind of need to link into this overall paper that we're putting together. What I would say is it's quite early days in terms of kind of identifying the financial implications. So I know we've talked about some headline numbers today. There's something for me over the next few weeks, months, about looking at those in a bit more detail. And in particular, I think we can see almost straight away that there will be a shortfall in terms of the funding that's available. So the paper does talk about what we've got at the moment. So I think Caroline has already touched on what's included in the HRA business plan. So we'll need to be looking at that in a bit more detail about what the shortfall is there. We've also got the 10 million that's earmarked in the current capital programme, £1 million per year. I mean, I think what we can see from the numbers tonight is that there will be a shortfall. So what the main part or the latter part of the report then does is start to talk about some of the options that might be available to us. And I think certainly they are just all options at this stage, and I think we should put them all onto the table, and we'll be exploring each of them over the next, I was going to say the next few months, but I think it's much wider than that. It's all the way to 2030 that I think we'll be talking about the funding of achieving the targets. We will, of course, want to maximise access to government grants, which I've touched on the paper. And I know we've already heard tonight about how successful we've been at Lancaster West. However, I don't think government grants and external funding will solve it. So what we've set out in paragraph 5.23 is some of the options that we might have in terms of borrowing, which I think we absolutely need to have them all on the table at this stage. Now, that full list that I've set out, there is a lot of work. What I should have said is there's an awful lot of work going on across London boroughs in terms of both looking at operationally achieving carbon zero and their commitments, but equally the financial implications as well. So certainly what we've tried to set out is that this is all of what's on the table that being considered by others. What we'll be doing over the next couple of months is obviously looking at each of those and seeing which are viable for Kensington and Chelsea in line with our Treasury strategy. And the final point before I just pass over to Mary is that I think I'm quite keen. So we're just about to go into MTFS, so medium-term financial planning. I think certainly from my perspective, achieving carbon zero almost needs to be an integral part of those conversations. So it's not something that we talk about separately. It's something that's part of those overall financial conversations that we have as an organisation. So the paper doesn't necessarily provide any recommendations or solutions. What I think it does is set out the kind of conversations that we need to be having over the next couple of months. And I don't think I've stolen anything that Mary was going to say, so I'll pass over to Mary for her update.
Mary.
Thank you, and well, thank you. No, Torrin, I mean, you've covered all the main points. I suppose I would just like to re-emphasise the context of all of this. And of course, the major thing that has really changed since the commitment was made was COVID and the effect that's had on our finances. We're already facing a very tight financial picture. And as you know, COVID has had an effect on our finances, particularly our ability to generate income. And although we have been very well supported by the government, the long-term effect of some of the knockoff of that income, we don't know yet, and that's an important part of our finance. And again, we've the listed there are various types of borrowing that we could do, or sources of borrowing, including some new ones that are sort of specifically to support green initiatives. But all of those forms of borrowing do need to be paid for in the long term and have revenue implications in a context where there are very many claims and pressures on that. But I think beginning to think about it now, making it an integral part of our MTFS and really making everybody throughout the council think about it and everything we do, it's a really important step forward. The committee, because we need to start thinking about it sooner rather than later. I think Torrin is clearly doing so, and we should all support the. That's really all I had to.
So, Mary, I think you've broken up there. I don't know whether you stopped or the line failed, but
I know I finished. I said that's all I had to add.
Okay,
You may have lost about a bit.
I lost a couple
that,
of words at the end, maybe, but anyway, thank you very much indeed. I think it's entirely clear from what's been put forward, what I would like to do is to ask Erin Aretti. You wanted to ask the first question on this.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I think Tyrone and Mary just summarized everything that I wanted to ask, but great report, definitely great report, touched all the points. Just, I wouldn't say a recommendation, but just a request to have a dedicated page on things that what we're doing so that the residents of the borough knows about our commitment to carbon neutral by 2040. But also in terms of the green initiatives that we're doing as a local borough, where we would probably allocate some funds for local projects. Just want to make the entire process transparent, right from the applications to approvals, and do a lot of advertisement so that people know that that these schemes are there for the local community to get involved, come up with ideas, and then contribute to the local area. So that's just my, I don't know, comment or recommendation, however you want to take it, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Has anybody else got a question to ask? Any other members of the committee would like to ask a question, the lead member or officers on paper? Okay, if I could try to summarize, I think, again, it would be worth us making a recommendation here. I think that we would like to support this proposal that the medium-term financial strategy should have this area of finance ingrained. How to ingrain it should be addressed. It's not, we can't say how it should be done, but I think we should say that we would support as a committee that it should be addressed. And we would like the officers and lead member to take up the challenge. And I think it is a big challenge. It's as I think Taryn has mentioned, it's a dynamic challenge as well. It's an evolving one. If you look at the proposals, for instance, if you take the biggest and in some ways the most straightforward and advanced and developed program of the housing one, we've talked about fabric first, then some kind of heating system replacement or whatever. We're not going to get rid of heating systems entirely. We're not going to have passive houses all over the place. So we have to have some sort of heating system, and the technology that's actually going to be the heating system in 10 years is not entirely clear. The assumption at the moment is it's going to be heat pumps of some sort, but where the electricity is going to come from, how it's going to be transmitted from the North Sea whirligigs to housing in North Kensington or wherever is not clear at every part of the path. And one of the big changes between gas and electricity is you can't store a month's worth of the stuff in the supply chain. So you haven't got that buffer. And a lot of people in the national grid have suddenly begun to realize this. And some very clever people are now talking about turning it into hydrogen and putting it into gas boilers so we can use all those lovely gas mains that we have around the place and an advanced boiler. But the key thing in that is that it hasn't yet been played through. There are experimental schemes. Lanc West is leading the way. But you can't do 10,000 Lanc Wests tomorrow. You can't go to the market and ask for it to be off the shelf in a framework contract or something of that sort. The labour for installation, how you actually put the stuff in design terms, where you're going to get it from, how much it's going to cost, what the lifetime costs of a heat pump are going to be, maintenance and all those sort of things have not yet been sorted out. So it'll be an evolving cost picture, but I think the fabric first approach in all buildings, which is by far the major component of what we got to do as a borough, both for 2030 and for 2040, is entirely the right approach. And that's been technically engaged with by Lanc West, the housing scheme, the schools scheme, by leading housing associations and private providers and so on have begun to go down that line. So some parts of this evolution that Taryn was talking about in terms of cost planning are relatively straightforward and well entrenched, and others are highly speculative. But the other thing is we've got coming down the tracks, as of the press announcements of today, that the national achievement of 2050 is now going to be wound forward to 2035. Now that'll be ambition, and it's got to be resourced, and it's got to be substantiated technically, and then it's got to be carried out in practice, which means cadence and achievement on the ground. So the first thing is getting it into the integral part of the MTFS and making sure that the MTFS, as I'm sure it will be, is entirely aligned with the audit and transparency risk register, for instance, and various other parts of the council's functioning is very important too. And it was Mary, I don't know whether you were in the meeting earlier on, but I mentioned that I'd heard that that the 2030 commitment is now on the risk register for audit and transparency. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a small detail, but it's significant, and it implies that different parts of the council are beginning to talk to each other, which is very good. So the takeaway that I get, Taryn, please correct me, is that current finance is not going to be able to do this. Grants will help, but unlikely to cover the piece. Borrowing of all sorts will be a component, but there are constraints on what we're allowed to do and what we might want to do, but they need exploring, and you've identified that in the paper. One of the parts of a model that's been put forward by Doug Goldring and others, and some of Kim's presentations and so on, is that basically we do the fabric first, then we do as much of the systems and so on as we can, and then maybe there's a residual that can't be done, and there would have to be some form of tax paid in a normal, in a national context. And I'm wondering whether it would be worth exploring, and maybe you've considered this already, that we do actually levy a tax on ourselves and on any assets that are not performing to our 2030 target, and therefore we do it by an offset. But we perhaps put that offset into a ring-fence fund within the council to reinvest in achieving that result. And that would be a sort of self-jacking exercise. So it would be controlled within the council. It would be dedicated to achieving the target that the penalty was being exacted for, and it would be a way of aligning business decisions to be aligned with achievement of the reducing the carbon footprint. I think that's something that might be worth looking at. I don't know how you feel about that suggestion.
I mean, my feeling at this stage is that all options should be considered. So, I mean, we haven't, I have to be honest, we haven't given this an awful lot of thought, but I think, the fact that you've raised it tonight is something that we can go in, have a look at. And we've touched a little bit on the offset fund there, but, I think, we've got to explore all options at this stage. So, yeah, let me take that away. Okay. And then we can, I suspect that the committee will want some regular updates, in a similar way that you've said on schools. This is really going to evolve, I think, over the next few months, 6 months, 9 months. So let's put that onto the table as one for us to take away and consider.
Yes, well, I think out of this paper. Sorry, Mary.
Sorry. Yeah. No, I was just going to add that I think, the key aspect here is that we're going to have to be agile, and that the financial environment is going to change so much between here and our commitment dates, and one aspect maybe I'm a bit more optimistic than Taryn about the availability of grants, because I think government will realise that this isn't something that local authorities can raise sufficient money for. They're quite flamboyant about their commitments, and so I'm suspecting that a bit more money perhaps than Taryn, being prudent and cautious as ever, might come our way. But we'll have to make some hard choices along the way. But let's not, try and make too many hard ones this year.
Okay, well, it's not our job as scrutiny to say how things should be done. But I think that what we would do as a recommendation, and Hannah, from what I've just said now, I think we can pull together a summary, in the form of a recommendation of things that perhaps are already in the paper, but things that we feel need to be focused on. Just draw attention to a few headings as I've put out there. I mean, one of the ones that came from one of the other papers, for instance, is this sorting out some of the wrinkles on leaseholders, for instance, is going to be perhaps something that needs to be considered as well. I know Kim's already got practice in dealing with that, fairly recently on a number of investment issues. But it is going to be difficult to align the ability of leaseholders to address their responsibilities at the pace at which we want to address some of the achievement in terms of property which we own as freeholder. I think we've touched on enough things there. So I will, Hannah, presumably you've taken a note of this discussion, and we can draw up a recommendation sort of ahead of heads, a number of bullet points. And to Taryn and Mary, I take your point that this is going to be encouraging you to address points which you're already perhaps addressing, rather than saying, why haven't you got the answers yet? Because, it's early doors on the conversation, and then suggesting that the answers might be forthcoming in, towards the autumn or something of that, or in the next stage in the answers, to take your point about being an iterative process, that it'd be useful to have an update on the answering of those topics in the autumn. And Mary, I think, your point about agility is going to be a good one. I mean, one of the things that's going to change the picture here is that if people work from home a lot of the time, this is going to change the picture on some of the analyses of how these things are cost effective or not. So thank you very much indeed. I assume there are no other points that members would like to ask, and it remains for me to thank Mary Wells, lead member, and Taryn for leading, but also to Anka and her team for participating in the papers generation as well, and I'm sure many others. And finally, to note that we've asked out of several other papers that people make sure from other fields, be they schools or whatever, that they feed in to your work what you need.
Yeah.
So thank you very much indeed for coming tonight. And that covers A9. That leaves, I think, A10 as far as we've got, which is the Select Committee Work Programme. I don't think there's a lot to discuss in this. One thing I would like to do is, first of all, I think we note the section 3.2, which outlines the 2 reports that we are going to be producing, and I'm going to be working with Jackie and Hannah to draft these up and circulate them to committee for comments, approvals, and so on. And we will aim to produce those by the next, for presentation at the next Select Committee's meeting in the summer. I'd then like to just make it asked to be recorded the fact that this is the 2030 focus in particular has been a very big subject. We've not really touched on 2040. I think my suggestion would be that 2040 is something that would need still to be looked at, maybe under next year's programme. The areas in this, we've touched a lot of areas under 2030, but the ones that I've identified that we've not touched are the impact of fibre to the premises, i.e., very high-speed internet. We've all suffered even tonight from some people not having proper internet, and that if people are going to work from home on a regular basis, that's going to be a component. We don't know, therefore, what the effect of COVID is going to be, whether people move to a regular part week at home, part week at the office. We've not looked at one of the biggest expenditure areas of the council in terms of its carbon footprint, which is adult social care. Adult social care is not our business, but the carbon impact or carbon footprint of it is. It's mostly done through commissioning, but we've not addressed that as an area. We know of the fact that there's work going on through facilities management on, for instance, the town hall, which is probably the biggest, but lots of other council buildings. But we've not looked at them, and the ITHRA report identifies them as the major sector. But I think there is work going on there and a consciousness of what needs to be done. We've looked indirectly at the leisure centre in the north through the Lank West project, but not at the one in the south. And between those two, there will be, that component. So I hope you agree that we've covered much of the ground, but not all of it. The big one is the housing one, though, that we've had lots of reports on. And in addition to its technical and carbon footprint impact, it has the social dimension of fuel poverty and other such associated issues. So I'd like to thank indirectly the communities and housing communities select committee, and particularly Greg Hammond, who chaired their working group, and Portia and I attended a couple of times with them. And their work is very complementary to what we've been doing. They look at a very different range of things, but it does touch the fuel poverty and sustainability and resilience area is definitely one of the fields where we overlap. And that will be mentioned in our report. So thank you, everybody, on the committee. This is our last meeting for this council year, and I hope to be working with you again for next year, but that is obviously up to all of you to decide. So thank you for your support, and I will work hard for the rest of the year on trying to produce the reports and working with you on that. So thank you, everybody. And unless there are any final questions, I'd like to thank Hannah and officers for supporting this meeting, and for all the other officers for attending and supporting the various papers. And thank you to you, the committee. I would like to say good night.